In this video, we pick up after Immanuel Kant, and we'll look briefly at Mary Wollstonecraft, as well as a brief discussion of the American Revolution, and finish with the German philosopher Hegel and the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. In the next video after that, we'll be discussing Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto and his criticisms of capitalism. To begin, Mary Wollstonecraft, in her text of Vindication of the Rights of Women, written at the end of the 18th century, is every bit as relevant today as it was over 200 years ago. While that makes for interesting reading, it should speak volumes about how little progress has indeed been made in terms of feminism. By now, in the 21st century, the writings of feminist authors from the 18th century should be dated. Distressingly, they are not. Hopefully, as you read A Vindication of the Rights of Women, you found it pleasant reading, a page-turner, relevant and worthwhile. It's been my hope that the readings I've selected for you this semester are relevant to your daily life. My intention has not been to waste your time. And hopefully this, even more so than most other things we've read, speaks to you in the here and now, even across the centuries. The argument that Wollstonecraft provides is simple and straightforward: that girls should be educated like and alongside of boys, meaning in the same way and in the same classrooms. But for her time, this is a radical idea. The prejudices of her society are: why would women need an education? You don't need book learning to make children or to cook and clean. In a society where those are strictly the gender roles for women, education would, to the dominant culture, which is a patriarchal masculine culture, appear unnecessary. For that reason, Wollstonecraft's overt argument is tailored to her audience and should seem unpleasant to our ears. Her argument is that women who are educated will be better conversation partners for their husbands. And to us, nowadays, that should seem slimy. Likely for the ladies that are taking this course, and you share all your classrooms with. Your purpose in getting an education is not for the benefit of your husband. That is women's education as a means instead of an end. But consider Wollstonecraft's cultural context. She's using arguments that will appeal to her audience, both the men of that time, perhaps even as well as the women. Whatever works. But there's another argument just slightly underneath that one, which is every bit as welcomed today as it would have been in the 18th century. That if we do not educate women, we are wasting half of the intellectual potential of our society. That still may seem a touch means-oriented. Women's education for everyone's benefit. But the idea that women's minds have worthwhile contributions intellectually, I don't think is necessarily dismissive nor reductionistic. The economic factors of late capitalism are a different matter entirely. We will have the opportunity to critically examine in our discussion of Karl Marx. So we'll save the economic necessities, as well as feminism and liberation through economic empowerment, for our discussions in the early 20th century. For now, we'll let Wollstonecraft be the opening shot in a centuries-long debate about feminism, which we'll return to at the dawn of the 20th century. We'll turn now to a brief historical interlude, which will serve a few purposes. Number one, to provide an philosophical justification for the economics of capitalism, represented in the text The Wealth of Nations, published in the same year of the birth of our nation, in England by Adam Smith. If we're going to discuss the economic philosophy and socio-political philosophy of Karl Marx's communism, we need to see what he's reacting against. The Wealth of Nations describes an invisible hand of the market in which supply organically matches with demand in a free market. This is similar to the argument Plato's Socrates had presented in the Republic, called the one man, one art principle, in which each person pursuing their own individual self-interest organizes society from the bottom up in the most efficient way possible. There we have one side of the debate, which Marx will provide the counter-argument for. My purpose in discussing the political philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, as opposed to that presented in the Constitution, is to identify a paradox or contradiction. No, that's not it. Before we approach the contradiction, let's first note a relevant counter-argument that the founding fathers of this country not only advocated freedom while themselves owning slaves. I'll leave your historian teachers to pick that one apart to the best of their ability. But for our purposes, do not seem to be conservative Christians. By and large, they in fact appear in their writings to be deists, or to espouse a philosophy called deism. Deism is the idea that there is some God or supreme power, but it's not a personal God. It's not a God to be prayed to for individual help and concern. The God of deism is largely one which sets the universe in motion and leaves it to unfold according to its own inherent principles. God as watchmaker, God as clockmaker, significantly not God the divine interventionist, and questionably God of incarnation. For example, Thomas Jefferson takes the New Testament and rewrites it, removing all elements of miracles and the supernatural, leaving behind a simple golden rule morality. I'll leave you to pursue that if you so desire. The God, lastly, of deism also is largely not the God of any one particular religion. It's the God towards which all different religions, in their variety, point towards. So, to sum this part up, a few semesters ago, I had a student whose research paper I thought made an insightful argument that I believe was accurate, historically and factually accurate, that the founding fathers of this nation were not, as many people think, creating a nation of conservative Christian values. Instead, they were creating the single most liberal nation on earth. And that this is not a country that's been recently undermined by liberal values, but instead, this student, who was the son of immigrants, made the argument that, in fact, the liberal principles on which this nation had been founded have, over the recent decades, been undermined by conservative principles. Now, undermining and liberal and conservative are loaded words. But he's certainly right on the fact that this nation is founded in ideas of liberty. You see them before you right there. We had discussed them with Locke and his letter concerning toleration, his influence on American political philosophy, and the government it spawns. This is a nation founded upon the idea of freedom of belief, freedom of religious practice, multicultural tolerance and acceptance, diversity. there's also a strain of white supremacist Puritanism. And those are in conflict, down to today. But the idea of a nation founded outside of religion, with a separation between church and state, is a most radical, revolutionary, and liberal idea. And it happens in response to the repressiveness of theocracy in Europe. When we look around the world at places where religion rules, and look at history for our own cultures, religion becomes oppressive when it's politically authoritarian. That, I am arguing, is the truth. Its relevance, I leave for you. But my purpose here is actually something different still. It's to point out not only the patriarchy and lack of feminism in this late 18th century text, to point out not that there's no mention of Jesus anywhere in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, which would make sense for deism, but specifically to deal with unalienable rights. Unalienable means cannot be taken away. That's the purpose of the word. The meaning is unchanged. The founders of our country were traitors and committed treason against their own government, took up military arms against it, because of a feeling or an idea that their government did not protect as unalienable life and liberty. The British colonial government, they felt, could take away life and liberty with impunity, with no recourse, or little to no recourse. And so they argued, any government that does not respect as unalienable such rights to life and liberty should be altered or abolished, should be replaced. This is the right to revolution. It's funny that in discussing the American Revolution, how dangerously close one gets intellectually to treason. If we followed our founding fathers' ideals, how would we respond to our government? We've made role models of insurrectionists. The Machiavellian point of might making right is also not what I think is important to emphasize here, but rather that when instituting a new constitution, there are no such mentions of unalienable rights to life or liberty. And the reason why I'm arguing is that the Declaration of Independence is idealistic. The Constitution must necessarily be pragmatic or practical. One could not have a society in which the government were entirely prohibited from killing anyone, or locking anyone up. That's not practical. You could not run a government that way. We want the police to be able to shoot people sometimes. If there's a guy running amok with a gun in an elementary school, I'm perfectly content from a moral point of view of having him shot dead right then and there. If there's a person going around molesting children, he should be locked up. What is ironic, paradoxical, or contradictory is that the reason which sent the Founding Fathers into revolutionary war, they cannot put into practice in the formation of their own government. So what's important and relevant for you is that there is no right to life or liberty. First off, those rights are inventions that we choose to protect or not. But secondly, if your life is not an unalienable right, meaning it cannot in any situation be taken away, but instead, given the circumstances, can be taken away, that's not a right but a privilege, which is not even a criticism. If you want to think through the implications of this privilege to life, imagine pointing a gun at a police officer. You'll find that the right to life is not unalienable. It can be revoked. In the state of Texas at present, try lighting a joint in front of the state capitol, and you'll find that liberty is also not unalienable. It's a privilege, and it can be taken away. How to make those two things go together? I've heard different attempts at explaining it away. Perhaps it can be explained. But my intuition is that there is a conflict there between an idealism expressed by the Declaration of Independence and a pragmatism expressed in the Constitution. Paradoxes are fine. Perhaps even contradictions are fine. But we're probably better for pointing them out than not realizing they're there. Lastly, before we move on, I've also provided in your readings a letter between Thomas Jefferson and John Madison regarding the income inequality in Europe Jefferson had experienced on his travels there. I merely point this out to show that income inequality, or the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, continues to be a relevant ethical, political, and intellectual issue for this time period. That will become especially obvious as we discuss Marx's attempt to deal with that economic inequality. we're coming around to the end and getting close to bringing this train into the station. We have 2 centuries now are all that separates us from the history of philosophy and you and me, mediated by technology. You see a number of authors here. Let's get right down to it. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is a very complicated philosopher whose texts are dense, dry, in my opinion, boring, incredibly challenging to read, which is why I didn't ask you to read any of it. His philosophy makes use of the term phenomenology. A simple definition is the study of phenomena, but that doesn't capture it accurately. Perhaps a better definition is that phenomenology is an attempt to heal the divide between subject and object. A divide which had been created by René Descartes, especially with his mind-body dualism. Descartes' mind-body dualism was designed to make science and medicine possible in an age of religious oppression. But you see the tangent that Red Herring had put intellectual history on. The text Phenomenology of Spirit attempts to analyze what in German is called the Zeitgeist. Zeit means time, Geist means ghost, but Zeitgeist doesn't mean time ghost, as cool of a sidekick for Space Ghost as that would be. Instead, it refers to the spirit of the age. And his argument is that the predominant feeling of an era goes through a predictable and cyclical motion. Which is referred to as a dialectic, or specifically the Hegelian dialectic. The Hegelian dialectic begins with an original idea called a thesis. This original idea spawns its equal and opposite other, its antithesis. This antithesis then combines with the original thesis to become a synthesis. The synthesis then becomes a new thesis, which spawns its antithesis, and then those two are combined to form a new synthesis, which repeats the process, and so on, and so on, and so on. This, for Hegel, is how history and culture makes progress. That we're actually going somewhere and getting somewhere. And that both things, ideas, people, and societies are getting better all the time. That's a fascinating debate by itself. This is also largely the inspiration for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to say that the arc of history bends towards justice. He's basing that on a reading of Hegel. There are various examples in isolation of this dialectic unfolding. Geocentrism responds with heliocentrism, which finds synthesis in Einsteinian relativity, where there is no center. We had just seen that rationalism spawned an equal and opposite empiricism, and that Immanuel Kant synthesizes the two in the Critique of Pure Reason, identifying both are necessary. In the history of religion, we have Judaism, its sort of equal and opposite, Christianity, and Islam is a sort of synthesis of a number of these ideas and cultural contexts. For Marx, feudalism, the divine right of kings, is the thesis. Capitalism, its equal and opposite other. And communism will be the ultimate end result. Communism, Marx argues, is what will come next in the history of economics and societies. I think that's sufficient for our purposes. So let's move on to our last author in this video, Soren Kierkegaard. We had actually done a good bit of the necessary discussion of Kierkegaard when we discussed Judaism and the origin of Abrahamic religion. Kierkegaard is a representative of what can be called theistic existentialism. He is what's called an existentialist that still manages to believe in God, but his belief in God, along with the other so-called theistic existentialists, is of a very different sort and a very darker variety than most optimistic, happy-go-lucky forms of belief that are much more common both in history and in our society. So let's use Kierkegaard as a foil to discuss the common features which the existentialists share in common. These will serve as recurring themes, and they're applicable whether the existentialist is a believer or, as is much more common, not a believer. The existentialists focus on what's called angst or anguish. I mistyped. This should say anxiety and despair. For Kierkegaard, the anguish is especially represented by Abraham. The anguished decision to go ahead with the human sacrifice of his son is one that would cause anyone to despair, to have anxiety, to feel angsty. Should I kill my son? These are the religious questions the devout person may have to wrestle with. But also one of, should I believe, and what should I believe in? And what happens if I get it wrong? These are the anguished, terrible decisions. Kierkegaard analyzes traditional religious belief of the sort our culture is accustomed to, puts on us. For the non-believers, this angst, anguish, anxiety, and despair comes from there being no God to tell us how to behave. Thus we are on our own. And the anxiety and despair that death looms ahead of us all and is inescapable. This re-emphasis on death is characteristic of the existential philosophers of the 19th and 20th century. The second feature, abandonment, has different meanings depending on whether the philosopher is of the theistic or atheistic, that is to say, believing or non-believing, faithful and devout or non-faithful or devout variety. For the atheists, the non-believers, abandonment simply means we have abandoned God. For the believers, God has abandoned us. We are kicked out of and exiled from the Garden of Eden. We pray, but hear nothing in response. We look up into the sky and see not a smiling face of a benevolent king waving back at us, as is in Monty Python in the Search for the Holy Grail. But instead, emptiness, nothing, empty, careless space. Jesus promises a return, and yet eons pass as we sit waiting. The epistemology, the standpoint from which religious knowledge begins, is not one of comfort and certainty for the theistic existentialists, but loneliness and fear. Religion is not easy, nor is it obvious, and this is difficult and challenging. Thirdly, meaninglessness, which for the atheists simply means if there is no God, there is no God-given meaning. Thus, we are free to create our own meaning and purpose in life. Atheistic existentialism is not pessimistic. Instead, it's considerably optimistic. We are free to choose our own meaning of life. If we're a square peg, we don't have to bother with trying to fit in a round hole. For the theistic existentialists, meaninglessness is less severe somewhat. It refers to the meaning of life provided by religion is neither easy nor obvious. We have to choose the religious meaning. It's not for granted. For the atheists, existential guilt, or inescapable existential guilt, means that if there's no God, there's no God to absolve us or forgive us for our sins. If we wrong someone, we have to make it up. If by our negligent actions someone is killed, that's it. There's no pleasant afterlife to make it all better. There's no magic being who we can speak to in our heads that can make us feel better about it. For the theistic existentialists, existential guilt takes ever so slightly different character. In Kierkegaard's analysis of Abraham, Father Abraham, founder of the three world great monotheistic religions, the guilt is, I was willing to cut my own son's throat. That's not something that goes away or that's easy to put out of your mind. But we also have the same problem of crying out to a God for forgiveness and hearing little else beside the sound of the wind and the leaves of the trees. Are we forgiven? Is it okay with God once we've sinned and begged for absolution? It's tough to know. That's the starting point for the theistic existentialists. The phrase existence precedes essence, and in fact, all of numbers 1 through 4 are really laid down in specific detail by Jean-Paul Sartre. You can just say Sartre. In the 1940s, 100 years after the development of these themes and motifs, existence precedes essence means that first we exist, and only then, afterwards, can we attempt to either invent and create or discover the meaning and purpose of our lives. And this would apply both for the atheists and the theists. For the atheists, no God-given meaning means it's open for us to create. For the theists, since we are in a state of abandonment, cut off in every realistic way from God, we have to search for meaning in the context of apparent meaninglessness. So, to re-emphasize, for Kierkegaard, as a theistic existentialist, religious belief is not something easy and obvious, but hard and fraught with challenges. It's an uncommon point of view, but both worthwhile and significant. In our next video, we'll discuss Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto.